I have competition from my great-grandson. Okay? Ready to start? Okay, good morning. Welcome to our class about Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is this Tuesday. Louder? Okay. Lag BaOmer is this Tuesday, and it's one of those minor, major holidays. It's minor in the sense that there are no restrictions, but it's major in terms of its spiritual significance. Excuse me. Actually, it's the one holiday that has more people in one place celebrating it than any other holiday. And this Tuesday, in Meron, the burial place of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, whose life is celebrated on that day, well over 100,000 Jews congregate in this small town in the northern part of Israel. Last year or the year before, there was a terrible tragedy where over 40 people were crushed to death because of the crowds. So I think now they sold tickets for 100,000 people, and there are far more that want to come. So what's the mystery of this holiday? There are actually two different historical events that occurred on this day, and they seem to be disparate, unconnected to one another, but they really are connected. So we'll talk about them chronologically. The first thing that happened is that Rabbi Akiva, perhaps if we talk about post-biblical personalities, and you had to list the 10 most important Jews in post-biblical times, he would be on that list. And Rabbi Akiva started his career as someone who literally hated Torah scholars. He hated scholars. He was a simple shepherd, but he had this passionate hatred. The Talmud even says that he said this about himself, that before I started learning Torah, I hated them. I would like to bite them like a donkey bites. I don't know how donkeys bite, but apparently they're not too pleasant. He had this passion against Torah scholars. And he was a shepherd in the house of the most wealthy Jew in Israel at that time, known as Carobs. That's a nickname. And he fell in love with Carobs' daughter, Rachel, who realized that Rabbi Akiva had tremendous potential. And she married him. She was disowned by her father. They lived in total poverty. He went to school together with his child, learning first. He was illiterate. And his passion for learning started to grow thanks to his wife's prodding. He once saw, the Talmud relates, he once saw a rock with a dent in it, and it was caused by droplets of water dripping on it for centuries perhaps. He said, if water could penetrate a hard rock, then the Torah, which is likened to water, could penetrate my brain. And indeed, it did. He spent 24 years studying Torah. And by the time he finished his 24 years studying under the greatest sages of his time, he became the greatest rabbi of his time and amassed 24,000 students. They just flocked after him. They couldn't get enough of his teachings. He was so brilliant. And his colleagues, when they started off, he was a nobody, and they were already great scholars. They looked at him as an incredible source of knowledge, and no one could possibly compare to him. But something terrible happened. 24,000 of his students perished during this period between the two holidays of Passover, Pesach, and Shavuos. It's not clear exactly if all 24,000 died, but it seems that some of them were spared on Lag BaOmer, on this day, the 33rd day of this period. Lag is not a word. Lag is just a number, 33, and Omer is the offering that they brought in the temple on the second day of Passover, from which time we start counting the days. So on the 33rd day of that counting, Rabbi Akiva's students ceased dying. Some would say that that was the end of the plague, and some say no, the plague continued afterwards. It was a respite, a pause that day of Lag BaOmer. Either way, this day is celebrated as the end of this terrible plague. Why was there such a plague? It only affected Rabbi Akiva's students, it seems. It didn't kill anybody else. Usually an epidemic doesn't single out one population. There's a myth that modern-day historians try to promote that Rabbi Akiva's students didn't die of a plague, they died in battle. That they joined Bar Kokhba, the one who fought for Israel's independence against the Romans and ultimately was defeated by the Romans, and that these 24,000 students were defeated in battle because Rabbi Akiva was a major supporter of Bar Kokhba. But that's total myth. There's absolutely no evidence to that. The Talmud says clearly that they died because it was a punishment, and the punishment was because of their lack of respect for one another. Because they didn't treat each other with respect, they all perished, or most of them perished. And this is the time of the year that we mourn and grieve their loss, and we have limited amount of mourning. We do not get married during this period except on Lag BaOmer. Some customs consider Lag BaOmer to be the end of that period of mourning. Some consider it to be the middle. There are a whole bunch of different customs, but everyone agrees that this is a period of sadness. And to this day, we're still remembering the loss of our 24,000 students. So the question is, my first question is, why are we making such a fuss? Why such a reaction to a tragedy which paled in comparison with other tragedies throughout Jewish history? Tragically, there are times in history when we lost more than 24,000, and we don't make such a fuss about it as we do about the loss of Rabbi Akiva's 24,000 students. So the answer, I believe, is based on the fact that this occurred not too long after the second temple was destroyed. The temple was considered to be the light of the world. There's a story in the Talmud. Herod, he was afraid of the rabbis, so he murdered as many rabbis as he could get his hands on. But he needed one rabbi to give him good advice. So he took this rabbi, Baba ben Buta. He took out his eyes and tried to test him to see if he was loyal. And when he couldn't get him to say anything negative, he regretted that he killed all these rabbis. And he said to Baba ben Buta, how can I atone for my sin? And he said, you blinded the light of the world by killing all these rabbis. And I guess he was alluding to the fact that he couldn't see either. I want you to rebuild the temple, because the temple was falling apart because of age. I want you to rebuild the temple, which is the light of the world. The temple is the instrument through which God's light entered the world. When the temple was destroyed, that light was extinguished, but was rekindled by Rabbi Akiva and his students. When the temple was destroyed, the leader of the Jewish people at that time, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, pleaded with Vespasian, the general who conquered and later the emperor of Rome, and he pleaded with him to spare the rabbis in the city of Yavna. And that's where Rabbi Akiva studied. He studied in that academy, and he became the major proponent of Jewish knowledge and established this academy with 24,000 students. And the light that was lost with the destruction of the temple was somewhat restored. But with their death, darkness shrouded the world. It was as if the temple was destroyed anew. So that's why, in a certain sense, it's like Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the day that we observe, the fast day that we observe and commemorate the destruction of both temples. And this was an extension of that, one could say. Now the question is, Rabbi Akiva was not just a great scholar, which of course he was, one of the greatest that ever lived, but he was also a man who was obsessed with the idea of love of your fellow. In fact, he's the author of the statement that the words in the Torah, love your fellow as yourself, is the major principle of Judaism. It's not just one of 613 commandments, one of many commandments, and important commandments. It's the very most fundamental commandment in Judaism. Love your fellow as yourself. So the Rebbe once asked, how could it be that of all the great sages, Rabbi Akiva's students were the ones who failed so miserably? You would expect his students to be a little bit more appreciative of the importance of loving your fellow as yourself. And here, they didn't get along with one another. We don't find that about other great rabbis. We don't find that about other sages, that their students didn't get along with one another. We find it only with Rabbi Akiva and his students. How could that be? So the Rebbe, on different occasions, gave three different answers. Answer number one, and this is a very important lesson for us. Each one of them was so obsessed with the idea of loving your fellow that each one felt that the other one didn't have that love, and they became intolerant of the other. And this is an interesting psychological thing. I know people who will talk to you about how important it is to be tolerant of everyone, to love everyone, and say it with such hatred, advocating love and peace. We see that today. Communism is advocated brotherhood. Everyone is equal. And they did it with such hatred, with such passionate hatred, murdering millions of people in the process of restoring peace and love and brotherhood and so on and so forth. The students of Rabbi Akiva, in a much more mild way, I would say, because they had such an obsession with the idea of loving your fellow, they was trying to criticize their colleague for not having that same love. You know what? To reach the love of your fellow, you have to do it with love. You can't do it with hatred. You have people today who are so hateful of others, who don't advocate their tolerance, or at least the way they understand tolerance and love. And because of that, there's such polarization in society today. It's because people are taking the ideals of unity and trying to impose it on everyone who don't have that same view of unity, and do it with such a lack of unity and lack of love. That's answer number one. And the lesson is that you should preach love with love, even if the other person doesn't have your level of love and acceptance and unity and tolerance. So not everyone will have the same as you. Don't hate them because of that. The second answer goes a little deeper. When you are a student of a teacher, there are different degrees of your devotion to those teachings. There are some people who come to a class and they listen and they absorb it and it registers and they file it in somewhere in the back of their brain. In some cases it goes in one ear, it goes out the other, but present company of course is excluded. But most students will come to a class, even if they're interested, they'll listen, they might like it, but they're not passionate about it. There always will be some students that will be passionate about the teachings of their teacher and be obsessed with it. They breathe it, they dream it, they wake up in the morning with it, they go to sleep with it. They're so enamored and so devoted to the teachings of their teacher. And that's a positive if the teacher is a good teacher and the ideas that you're committed to are positive ideas. But then there's another trait, a positive trait, that you love and care for your fellow student as you care for yourself, and even more. You're passionate about your love for another. Put those two together, it's a recipe for disaster. You know why? If I'm so committed to my teacher's teachings, but I also want my fellow student, my colleague, to have the same commitment, because I love him, and I think it's terrible that he doesn't have that knowledge, or he doesn't have it the right way. So what do? I try to tell this person, you know what? You misunderstood what our teacher was telling us. And I can't tolerate, because I'm pained that you don't have the right idea, because I love you. I want you to have the right idea. So I try to impose my understanding of my teacher, because I'm so passionate about it, on my colleague. But the problem is my colleague is equally passionate about Rabbi Akiva's teachings. And he loves me just as much as I love him. So he tries to impose his ideas on me. So we're both, out of love and out of commitment and devotion to the teachings, trying to impose our understanding on the other, and that develops friction. And we lack respect for one another. Love is not enough. In any relationship, in a marriage, and in any relationship, you can't just say, but if there's love, that's all you need. You also need respect. You also have to recognize the individuality of the other, and yes, it's true, I'm in love with this idea, and I'm in love with you, and I want you to share my beliefs, my understanding. But when the other person says, no, back off, I have the opposite view, don't try to pressure that person to the point where you lose respect for one another. Then the Rebbe once gave a mystical explanation why Rabbi Akiva's students were so incapable of getting along with one another. And this is based on an idea that I mentioned many times. In Kabbalah, in Jewish mystical teachings, there are two dimensions of spirituality, two worlds, two spiritual worlds. The higher one is called Tohu. Tohu is chaos. It's a world in which there is incredible, phenomenal, spiritual light and energy. But the problem is that there are very limited vessels in which to contain that energy. What happens is several things. Number one, it shatters the vessels. So it's very powerful light. If you plug something in the wrong outlet, the wrong type of electricity, you're going to have a short circuit. The whole system will destroy the whole thing because there's too much energy, and you don't have the right instrumentation. Another thing that happens is that you're monolithic. You only have one direction in which to go. We know that there are many traits. We spoke about this last week. There are 7 emotions. There are people who are people with kindness and love. There are people who are more rigid. But the good thing about people is that we're not monolithic, that we're a composite of different traits. We have a lot of one, but a little bit of the other. We synthesize. But in the world of Tohu, if you are chesed, if you are kindness, you can't recognize there's any other trait. If you are rigid and disciplinarian, that's it. There's nothing, you will not compromise, because you have this powerful energy and it doesn't allow itself to be tempered by any other trait. And what happens when you have a soul from the world of Tohu, you can't get along with anyone who has a different trait, who has a different attitude. You're just fixated on one trait, and you can't get along with anyone from any other trait. And what happens then is you become enemies and you conflict with one another. And that's what happened. These souls were very high souls. We also know that going back hundreds of years, Nadav and Avihu, Aaron, Moses' brothers, 2 sons, brought an unauthorized offering to God, and they were stricken by a fire that came from heaven and consumed them. Their souls, the Kabbalists say, also came from the world of Tohu. Their passion was uncontrollable. They had no vessels to contain it. We are living in the world of tikkun. Tikkun means perfection, correction. Our world has limited energy, but ample instruments. The ultimate goal, and that's what will happen in the Messianic age, is that the powerful light of Tohu will find expression in the ample and broad vessels of tikkun. That's the ultimate goal, and thousands of years we've been preparing for it. Every time we do a mitzvah, we bring more light into the world, but we're also broadening the vessels, the instruments, and we're making them more receptive to the more greater light. Every now and then, a soul enters the world that doesn't have those instruments and just has the passion, and those were the souls of Rabbi Akiva's students. Okay, we can speak about Rabbi Akiva for years, but I just wanted to give you the main point that Rabbi Akiva's students, who represented the future, the potential future for the light of the temple coming back into the world, was extinguished. That light was extinguished, and therefore we feel the pain that was accompanied their deaths. But Lag BaOmer, that day, Tuesday, is the day that the dying of the students ceased or paused, and therefore it's a day of celebration. But the main reason for Lag BaOmer is actually the second reason, and the second reason is a little bit more difficult to understand. Rabbi Akiva, after he lost his students, he lived in the north of Israel. He went south, and he acquired 5 new students. I'm not sure if it's only 5, but these 5 were like Rabbi Akiva himself. These were towering scholars and very holy people. Among these 5, the greatest of them was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai. He was, without any question, the most prominent of all Rabbi Akiva's students. And he's mentioned in the Talmud a few thousand times. His views are constantly mentioned, but he also is the author of the principal work of Kabbalah called the Zohar, which means the book of light, of splendor, of radiance. And these are the teachings, the Jewish mystical teachings. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was an enemy of the Romans. After the Romans perpetrated the worst atrocities against the Jews with the destruction of the temple and later on the destruction of Beitar and the defeat of Bar Kokhba, millions of Jews were murdered. The Romans didn't clamp down as much after those events, and 3 rabbis were sitting together, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yossi. Those are all 3 of the 5 students of Rabbi Akiva. And they were talking about current events. And Rabbi Yehuda praised the Romans for all the good that they do to construct roads and all sorts of rebuilding of the empire. And he tried to point out that they're not all negative. There's some positive things about them. Rabbi Shimon could not tolerate that. He says, no, there's nothing positive about them. All they do is for their own self-aggrandizement, for their own their own personal and selfish interests. Don't praise them. And the third rabbi, Rabbi Yossi, was more careful. He didn't want to say anything, bad or good. When the Romans found out about this discussion, someone was there who overheard this, and you know how people tell secrets. I'm telling you a secret, but don't tell anybody else. And then that person says to his friend, I'm going to tell you a secret, but you're the only person I'm going to say it to. Don't tell anyone else. Well, it finally got to the ears of the Romans, and they decreed Rabbi Yehuda will be elevated to the position. He'll be the leading spokesman of the Jewish people. Rabbi Yossi will be banished into exile. He could not leave his city, Tzipori. And Rabbi Shimon has to be put to death. So he fled, and together with his son, Rabbi Elazar, they hid in a cave for 13 years. And they lived on a carob tree that produced carobs. And that's why some people have a custom to eat carobs on Lag BaOmer. So, what was so special about this Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai that we celebrate Lag BaOmer? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai devoted his life to teaching the Talmud, Talmudic law. He's the most quoted one of the most quoted, if not the most quoted rabbi in the Talmud. But he also had a select group of students to whom he imparted the secrets of the Torah, the mystical teachings of Torah. And the day that he passed away, he revealed teachings that he never said before. And he said that that day, he knew he was going to leave this world, should be a day of celebration. So he actually passed away on Lag BaOmer, on that day. And he said, I want this to be a day of celebration because this is my wedding day. He meant the word wedding in the sense of my soul will be reunited with its maker, with God. And from that day on, that became a joyous day, a time of celebration. What do we do on Lag BaOmer? There were different customs. One of them is for kids and adults, if they want, to go to the park, to the fields, and they play with a bow and arrow. A bow and arrow. What's the significance of that? So again, the secular historians say, you see, it's connected to battle. It's connected to Bar Kokhba's revolt. And these were the students who died because of the revolt. No, it has nothing to do with that. The Talmud says that the rainbow, which is mentioned in the Torah, at which point? Where is rainbow mentioned in the Torah? What? Noah. After the flood, God showed Noah a rainbow, and he said, this is a reminder that I'm never going to destroy the world again, the way I did with the flood. So even though a rainbow was a natural phenomenon, whenever you see a rainbow, it's supposed to remind people to shape up. Because if not, you would deserve to have the same fate as the flood of Noah. It's a reminder that we're not really doing what we have to do to correct what the people of the generation of the flood did wrong. So the Talmud says that in the days of Rabbi Shimon's life, there was no need for the rainbow. Because his presence in the world, his merits were so great that he was able to erase all the negativity of the generation, that they didn't need a reminder. He was the reminder. He was the rainbow. His life was the rainbow. The Zohar also mentions that the rainbow is a message that Mashiach is coming. It's a precursor to the coming of Mashiach. The rainbow is an expression of God's glory. That's why it's a reminder for us. God is saying to us, see, I'm revealing my glory. You have a choice. You could either mess up and delay the coming of Mashiach, of the redemption, or you could shape up and hasten the redemption. So what does it have to do with a bow and arrow? Because the rainbow is like a bow. So to remind us of that, we use the bow and arrow as a reminder that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's role in this world was to remove all the negatives and prepare us for the coming of Mashiach. Then there's another explanation given in Hasidic thought about the rainbow, the bow and arrow. There's a story in the book of Shmuel, Samuel. Everyone heard of King David, of course, but not that many people know that his father-in-law was King Saul, Shaul. Now, King Shaul was the first Jewish king anointed by the prophet Shmuel, Samuel. And after a while, he became very jealous of King David. King David was more popular than him. And King David was actually anointed by Shmuel to be the next king. And Shaul became paranoid. And he wanted to kill David. But it wasn't 100% sure that he wanted to kill him. Now, David's best friend, who he had a very passionate love for, was Jonathan, King Shaul's son. They were as close as you can get. The friendship was the ultimate friendship. So King David was afraid to show up at the feast. Every month they would have on Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, they would have a feast. And the king was there, and King David was expected to be there, and Jonathan was there. But King David would not show up. So King David wanted to know, how far is my father-in-law's hatred for me? So he told Jonathan to gauge his father-in-law's anger. And he would convey his anger, whether he was that angry or not, by way of a signal. King David would hide next to a certain rock, and Jonathan would come with a bow and arrow with a youth to accompany him. He would shoot some arrows. And Jonathan said, if I tell the youth, you went too far, the arrows are closer to us, that's a good sign. That means you're safe. But if I say to the youth, the arrows are way beyond where you are, you flew too far, that's a bad sign. What was the symbol over there? If the arrows were close, that means that King David's time to lead was coming close. And he wouldn't have to struggle. He wouldn't have to try to flee the wrath of King Saul. But if the arrows were way, way far away, it means your time has not come yet. You're going to struggle. You're going to suffer. You're going to have to escape the wrath of my father. So that's the story in the book of Samuel. And this is about the future of the Jewish people, because King David was the beginning of a new era that would lead the way ultimately to the coming of Mashiach. Mashiach has to be a descendant of King David. And King David wanted to know whether his time has come to start this new dynasty, or perhaps it was premature and it's not going to come so easy. And it's all based on the bow and arrow. What is the significance? There are so many other ways King David or Jonathan could have signaled to King David about his future, whether his father-in-law is going to embrace him or he's going to reject him. Why did he have to use this thing with a bow and arrow? There's so many other creative ways of hinting something. So in Hasidic thought, it explains, based on Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, tells his son Joseph, I'm giving you the city of Shechem. Today they call it Nablus. Shechem was given to Joseph. And what does Jacob say? It's the city that I conquered with my sword and with my bow and arrow. In Hasidic thought, the sword and the bow and arrow are metaphors. When we want to tackle evil, there are two ways, because there are two kinds of evil. One kind of evil is very close. It's obvious. You can take a sword. It's right next to you. It's open. It's exposed. You take a sword. When you fight with a sword, you're fighting with an adversary who's right next to you. But if the adversary is hiding, the adversary is far away, you can't reach that adversary with a sword. You need a bow and arrow. Now, of course, they have guns. But in the olden days, if they had to fight a distant enemy, you fought the distant enemy with a bow and arrow. The same thing is true with our struggle that we have with negativity. There's a kind of negativity that we all have that is clear, it's obvious. People do bad things. People have bad attitudes, and they show it very clearly. For that, you can use a weapon that doesn't reach very far. A sword. That refers to the teachings of Torah that tell us how to behave. That's what Torah is all about. 613 commandments are commandments about proper behavior. But if you have to reach a distant enemy, an enemy that lurks deep beneath the surface, it's an enemy that we're not even aware that we possess, but it's certain types of attitudes that go deeply, they're deeply embedded in us. You can't just use a manual that tells you what's right and what's wrong, because you can be doing the right things, but down below there's some rot. And that rot could sometimes manifest itself in doing terrible things, but you're not prepared for it because you couldn't deal with that rot which is deeply embedded in you. So for that you need the mystical teachings of Judaism. One more important point. How do you shoot a bow and arrow? By pulling the string deep into you. The deeper it goes into you, the farther it'll fly. That means in order to tackle the hidden evil, the distant evil, you have to go deep inside your own soul. You can't just do it with surface powers. How do you get those deeper aspects of your soul revealed? Just by doing good? Not enough. Just by studying the laws of the Torah? Not enough. You have to develop an appreciation for the spiritual dimension of who you are, who we are. You have to study the part of Torah that deals with the secrets of Torah, which unlock the secrets of our soul. So you have to pull the string of the bow deep inside of you. You can't just fight with the surface faculties that we possess. And moreover, if you shoot an arrow, you want to shoot it up. The lower you pull the string, the higher it will go. That means the lower we reach in terms of looking for the good in every aspect of life, not just looking for good in spiritual matters, but all of what we've gone through in thousands of years, the Kabbalists refer to as the service of refinement, where we take physical things that are not holy and we extract the holiness from them. So the deeper you go downward, the higher you will fly. That's what the teachings of Kabbalah and Hasidic thought emphasize, that you can reach a higher level by finding and excavating and finding the positive sparks of holiness in everything in this world, even more than if you just pray and study Torah. Studying Torah and praying is you're pulling the string not very low. But when you pull the string all the way down, it has the power to reach very, very high. And that's what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's innovation was. He started to reveal for the first time in history the mystical teachings of Judaism and enabled us to go deeper into our own soul, to be able to reach higher levels and to go further and reach more distant enemies. That's why we play with the bow and arrow, to indicate that unlike all the other aspects of Judaism where you're using a sword, a weapon that is in close contact because you know where the enemy is, the bow and arrow could reach a level of impurity that you couldn't reach otherwise. Now it's interesting that a bow is a half a circle. How do you say circle in Hebrew? Gal, gal. So if you take a half of that, it's gal. Gal is 33. So it's a hint. The bow is the hint to the Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. It's the day when we have the power to go deeper into our soul and to go higher, reach higher, and go further than we could ever do any other time. In one of the Rebbe's talks that I just saw yesterday, my wife showed it to me. The Rebbe says, why did they stop dying on Lag BaOmer? If they still didn't treat their fellow with respect, then why did they stop dying? If they did treat their fellow with respect, if they changed, then what does it have to do with Lag BaOmer? They changed. And the Rebbe says the Lag BaOmer, the day itself, had the power to change people. This is the day that you're able to transform yourself and transform others. Because in Judaism we believe, and this is unique to Judaism, that time has a soul. Most people think of time as something you just pass through. No, we don't pass through. Time is a commodity. It's a substance. Just like this podium has its existence, and we could use it for good things, we could use it for bad things, or not use it at all. The same thing is true with every day. Every day has its own character, its own soul. And Shabbos is not like a weekday. If we're sensitive, we could tell that today is Shabbos, and it's a different world. They used to say there was a Hasidic Rebbe, Reb Chaim of Chernovitz. His special mitzvah was Shabbos. Then on Shabbos, he was taller than any other day of the week. Everyone looked at him, whether he was physically taller, but he had that appearance that he was taller. He had a different... A doctor once commented, this is 150 years ago, that when he takes the pulse of a Jew on Shabbos, it feels different than the pulse that he would take during the week. Shabbos, your whole being is different. The Talmud says that a person who's suspected of lying, and you couldn't trust him about something, whether it was kosher or not, if he tells you something on Shabbos, you could believe him. On Shabbos, you don't lie. Now, I'm sure there are people who could show that that's not true, that they can lie very well. God never takes away free choice from us, but there are certain times when we're more susceptible to spirituality than others. Shabbos is one example. Well, Lag BaOmer is a day when we have this ability to get closer to one another. So what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, because on this day we have this bow that we can go deeper into our own psyche, into our own soul, and when we go deeper into it, we don't feel the conflict between ourselves and others. I don't know about everyone, but I know people who have negative feelings about others, but when they drink alcohol and they become a little tipsy, they'll start kissing that person. But that person you don't like, you hate that person, so why are you kissing him right now? The answer is the hatred is on the surface. When you go deeper into your psyche, and not everyone, I'm sure there are people who hate you no matter what condition they're in, but many people, when they're in a state where they're more in touch with what's going on inside, because when a person is drunk, they will reveal secrets. They have no inhibitions. So when you lose those inhibitions, you realize, I don't hate that person that much. And you'll go over and even embrace that person. Well, Lag BaOmer, you don't have to drink to feel that way. Lag BaOmer, if you open yourself up, you'll feel the inner part of who we are, and that will correct the problem of Rabbi Akiva's students, that they couldn't treat each other with respect, because on Lag BaOmer, we are in touch with a deeper part of our soul. So it's a minor holiday, but it's a major minor holiday. Any questions? Yes?
What's the connection between haircuts for 3-year-olds and Lag BaOmer?
Okay.
What's the origin?
When it started, I don't know, but the custom that many Jews have in many communities is not to give a boy a haircut before the age of 3. I remember when my son Yeshua was 2 years old, and I had my parents visiting, All of a sudden, the police come and they say, is this your little girl? He was walking on Kenmore Avenue. He escaped. I still remind him of that. They thought he was a little girl because he had long hair. We don't give a haircut to the boy. Now, when he turns 3, we don't delay. We give the haircut right away. But because in this period we don't give haircuts, that's part of the mourning of this period, people wait for Lag BaOmer to give their first haircut. And at that time, it accumulates, and many people, so when they go to Meron, thousands of little kids, hundreds, maybe even thousands, are given their first haircut.
Where's the minhag come from that the age of 3 for your first haircut?
What's the first source of it? I don't know offhand, but it's a very old custom.
Like a tree, you cannot.
Right, it's based on the Torah's prohibition of using the fruit of a tree before 3 years. The 4th year you can use the fruit of the tree. I also think it's based on the fact that, according to the Jewish sources, Abraham's entry into destroying idols started when he was 3. That's when he started to think about who created this world, and he developed monotheism. It took a few decades, but he started at the age of 3. According to Maimonides, the reason why the Torah says not to cut our sideburns, the payas as they're called, is because that was a custom of pagans to cut their sideburns. And it's our way of rejecting idolatry. So that's why at the age of 3, we initiate a child to be like Abraham, who started to destroy idols at the age of 3. That's my own thought, but the traditional view is it's based on the law of not benefiting from the fruit of a tree for the first 3 years. And the idea behind that is that the 4th year, the fruit is considered holy. That means if you start a child off too early, the child doesn't really appreciate the importance of it. When you can't eat fruit for 3 years, and the 4th year you can eat it, you treat it with much more reverence. Any other questions? Anyone on Zoom? Okay, so everyone.
To eat colored eggs.
Some people have a custom to eat eggs, colored eggs. Why eggs? What?
Why colored eggs?
Oh, colored eggs I can explain, but why eggs?
Because that's when Rabbi Shimon by Yochai passed away.
So it's customary to give mourners eggs because an egg has no mouth, and a mourner is in such grief that he can't talk, he can't express himself. But why do we color the eggs? Because it's a day that we remember his passing, but it's not a sad day. So the coloring is like to take away from the sadness associated with the egg.
Also, it's interesting that Lag BaOmer is always the same day.
As Purim, right? What's the connection?
Joy.
Yeah, it's a joyous day. In New York and many other places, they have a parade with children. Thousands of children parade down Eastern Parkway. They close the whole Eastern Parkway, and thousands of children parade. And the Rebbe would have, when they had these parades, the Rebbe would come out and speak to the thousands of children. And once the Rebbe commented that, it's a long story, I'll just... there's a question about a certain prayer, whether it's recited Friday night or not. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, the famous Hasidic master, said we should say that prayer. Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, disagreed. He says, no, we don't say that prayer. So once Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, they were very close friends, said to Rabbi Shneir Zalman, known as the Alter Rebbe, he said, you should know that when people say that prayer, there's a big yerid in heaven. A yerid is a...
Fair.
What? A fair. A huge fair in heaven. And the Alter Rebbe responded, I can't go to every fair. So the Rebbe said about the parade of Lag BaOmer, Rabbi Shimon by Yochai is at this fair. He is present. And that's when the Rebbe, there was a few weeks before the Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War, and everyone in Israel was terrified that we're going to be massacred. They were preparing graves for tens of thousands of civilians. And the Prime Minister of Israel did not give any assurance. It was Levi Heschel at that time. His speech to the people was very depressing. And the Rebbe at that parade got up there and said there's going to be a major victory. And he spoke with such confidence, and it changed the whole atmosphere in Israel because of that. That happened on Lag BaOmer. It's another interesting thing. A parade, you don't want rain in a parade. And every year, Lag BaOmer, the forecast was rain, that I remember, every single year. Yet, for the parade, the rain stopped. And then, I just heard this yesterday, someone heard this from someone who heard it from the person who was there, that the police were communicating, there was a lot of police there because they had to close off the streets, and the police were communicating with other police, and they were saying in every neighborhood it was pouring. The only neighborhood where there was no rain was Crown Heights. So, that's how important the parade was then. Yes?
Isn't there also bonfires are a tradition?
Yes, some people make bonfires. The reason for that probably might be more than one reason, is because the Zohar means light, radiance. So the bonfires are to remind us of the light that Rabbi Shimon by Yochai brought into the world. But it's incredible. In Meron, in the past there were hundreds of thousands of people who would come there, and there's nothing else like it. But it helps the fact that it's not a major holiday where you can't do, work is restricted. So that would have prevented people from getting there and doing things. So that contributes to it, but nevertheless it shows the extent to which people think of this holiday as being so special and so holy. And all over the world there are celebrations that happen on this day. Okay, everyone have a good week and a happy Lag BaOmer.